The Labors of Hercules, Labor 1, The Nemean Lion, rewritten by Raymond Davey. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss out on any new stories, whether they're reimagined fairy tales, classic plays, or timeless legends, and it helps support more content like this. Now sit back, relax, and join me as our story begins. Chapter 1, The Assignment. The oracle's words hung heavy in the dimly lit room, each syllable a condemnation that felt as tangible as a sword pressed to his chest. It is not through victory alone that penance will be won, Hercules. To cleanse the blood upon your hands, you must serve. Hercules' fists clenched at her words, the sinews of his forearms standing taut beneath his weathered skin. Her final instructions were unmistakable. Hercules was to seek out Eurystheus, king of Tyrans and Mycenae, a man of slight build and even slighter courage who held little warmth for the son of Zeus. Eurystheus had always regarded Hercules with a simmering resentment, wary of his strength and power, qualities that could overshadow a mortal king and perhaps even topple a kingdom if they ever turned. In Hercules, he saw a threat dressed in the guise of an ally. And now, knowing the oracle's command, he saw something else, an opportunity. When Hercules arrived at the king's court, the guards did not hide their unease. His very presence filled the stone hall, shadows cast long and dark across the floor as he entered. Silence fell over the room, a silence that spoke to the quiet authority he commanded simply by existing. The journey had been long, and the weight of the oracle's words still pressed upon him, heavy as any iron chain. King Eurystheus sat high on his throne, his expression pinched and calculating. He leaned forward, fingers pressed together in a steeple, as if to convey an authority he had never truly earned. Hercules stopped before him, shoulders squared, his face expressionless. "Heracles," Eurystheus began, his voice brittle with forced confidence. He stumbled slightly on the name, the Greek pronunciation unfamiliar in his mouth. "So you've come to me, then, as the oracle decreed." Hercules did not bother to correct him, though the mispronunciation irked him in the slightest. He simply inclined his head, an acknowledgement rather than respect, his gaze never wavering from the king. "Your penance," Eurystheus continued, "is a series of labors, tasks that will prove your worthiness to stand among men once more." His voice held a note of relish, a thin attempt to disguise his delight at the power he now wielded over the demigod. "Each labor will be a trial, a test of your strength, your endurance, and perhaps your loyalty." The king's eyes flickered with a dark gleam. Here was the moment he had waited for, a chance to bend Hercules to his will, to place a yoke upon a god-touched man who had long lived beyond his influence. "For your first labor," Eurystheus said, his tone sliding toward satisfaction, "you will slay the Nemean Lion." A murmur rippled through the court, a mixture of awe and dread. Hercules heard it but kept his eyes on Eurystheus, reading the unspoken intent within his gaze. The Nemean lion was no mere beast. It was a terror, an animal of such raw ferocity that it had left the hills of Nemea soaked in blood. Its hide was said to be impenetrable, a living armor that swords, spears, and arrows failed to pierce. Warriors who had dared to confront it had met gruesome ends, and those who had survived carried tales of its unstoppable fury. The king's lips quirked into a thin smile, watching Hercules absorb the task. "The lion's hide is proof against all weapons forged by mortal hands," Eurystheus added, the glint in his eye revealing his confidence that Hercules would not return from this labor. "It has already feasted on the bones of many brave men." Hercules stood unmoved. He met the king's gaze with the same steady calm, though beneath that composure a new resolve began to solidify. He knew well that this labor and those to come were meant as punishment, not only to absolve his sins, but also to serve Eurystheus's own agenda. He had seen that cunning in others before, men who thought themselves wiser by forcing the mighty to serve their own ambitions. With a nod, Hercules spoke at last, his voice a rumble that filled the hall. "And when the lion is slain? Bring me its hide," Eurystheus answered, almost casually, "as proof." A flicker of acknowledgement passed through Hercules' eyes, but he offered no further response. He knew better than to expect honor or nobility from the likes of Eurystheus. This labor, he understood, was only the beginning of a trial that would lead him to the brink, and perhaps past it. He turned, ready to leave the court and seek out this deadly creature. As he walked away, He felt the weight of the task settling upon him, heavier even than the blood on his hands. This lion, this near-mythical beast, was more than just a creature. It was the embodiment of his first step on a path that might finally offer him the redemption he sought, if he could survive it. Chapter 2. Journey to Nemea. The road to Nemea stretched wide and empty before Hercules, lined by gnarled olive trees and silent hills that seemed to watch his approach with a patient, almost ominous stillness. He walked alone, his massive frame casting a solitary shadow under the early morning light. For all his strength, he could feel the weight of the task pressing against him, settling in his bones like a chill he couldn't shake. This was no mere hunt, no straightforward challenge. This labor held something darker, something that set his every instinct on edge. As he drew closer to the village, signs of the Nemean Lion's presence began to reveal themselves. Fields lay untended, with crops rotting in the soil, and barns stood abandoned, their doors swinging open and empty. He passed homes whose doors had been nailed shut, a desperate attempt by villagers to stave off the inevitable terror that lurked in the forest beyond. The closer he got to the heart of Nemea, the more the countryside took on an air of hushed mourning, as though even the land itself feared the beast that haunted it. By midday, he reached a gathering of villagers clustered near a half-collapsed inn. Their faces were drawn, eyes hollow with sleeplessness, each man and woman looking up at Hercules with a mix of awe and desperation as he approached. "It's true, then," one older man murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind. "The hero Hercules has come." Hercules inclined his head in acknowledgement, his gaze steady as he observed the crowd. These people had clearly endured much. Their clothes were frayed, bodies hunched with weariness, and eyes sharp with the knowledge that they'd lost far too much to the beast. He could see the toll the lion had exacted, not only in lives but in hope. The man took a hesitant step forward, casting a wary glance over his shoulder as if even speaking of the creature might summon it. You come for the lion?" Hercules nodded. "I do." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a whisper of hope mingling with fear. A younger woman, clutching a child to her chest, stepped forward. Her voice was low, almost pleading. "It's killed more than we can count. Animals, crops, even our children." Her words caught in her throat, and she clutched her child tighter. The older man nodded, his face grim. "We've tried to hunt it ourselves, but arrows and spears break against its hide. The bravest men in the village went after it, only to be found in pieces, scattered like straw. It's like no lion we've ever seen." Hercules listened, absorbing their words. He had faced beasts and monsters before, creatures born from divine spite and fury, but this lion sounded different, wilder, driven by a rage that seemed to possess its very bones. The stories surrounding it had spread far and wide, yet none had prepared him for the visceral fear he now saw in these villagers' eyes. "Where does it make its lair?" he asked. The villagers hesitated, exchanging glances as though the very thought chilled them. Finally, a young boy pointed toward the dense forest that loomed beyond the last stretch of fields. "Deep in there, near the old cave, but it comes and goes as it pleases." Hercules followed the boy's gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the dense, shadowed trees stretching up toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The forest lay shrouded in a stillness that felt unnatural, an eerie silence that swallowed the ambient sounds of the village behind him. With a final nod to the villagers, he turned his steps toward the trees, each stride taking him deeper into the quiet. The path quickly grew narrow, winding through brambles and low-hanging branches that clawed at his arms and cloak, as though the very forest sought to slow his advance. The sun dimmed above him, blotted out by thick canopies that allowed only faint streams of light to seep through, casting the ground in a patchwork of shadows. With each step, the air seemed to grow heavier, the once crisp scent of the countryside giving way to the earthy musk of damp leaves and ancient soil. The deeper he ventured, the darker the woods became. It was a darkness that felt alive, pressing close, filling the air with a quiet anticipation. Small animals darted out of sight, rustling in the underbrush before disappearing into silence, as though they too were wary of what lurked deeper within. Hercules tightened his grip on his club, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. It was an old weapon, sturdy and unassuming, yet it had never failed him. Still, he knew that strength alone might not be enough. The villager's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the lion's invulnerable hide, its savage ferocity. This beast was no simple predator. It was a creature born of something darker, something he could feel even now as he drew closer to its lair. As he neared the cave's entrance, the forest grew colder, the air thickening with a sense of foreboding that settled over him like a shroud. The entrance loomed ahead, framed by twisted roots and jagged rocks that seemed to leer out from the shadows. A faint, metallic scent clung to the air, blood, recent and raw, a reminder of the lion's appetite. Hercules stopped a few paces from the entrance, taking in the sight. This was the place the villagers feared, the lair where the lion had dragged countless victims to their deaths. The silence here was absolute, a heavy stillness that felt like it had been crafted by the lion itself, a warning to any who dared approach. For a moment, Hercules stood, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the cave. He could feel the faint tremor of tension building in his muscles, the electric anticipation that came before a fight. Yet beneath that, there was something else, a quiet certainty, the kind that had steadied him in the face of every trial he'd faced. This was what he had come for, the first of many labors. With a final glance back at the path he'd taken, Hercules took a step forward, entering the shadowed mouth of the cave. Chapter 3: The First Encounter. The shadows within the cave wrapped around Hercules like a shroud, each step echoing softly against the stone walls, amplified by the silence that permeated the lair. The scent of earth and stale blood grew stronger, mingling with a faint, foul musk that clung to the back of his throat. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the silence was broken by the faintest of sounds, a low, menacing rumble, deep and guttural, reverberating from the depths of the cave. Hercules stopped, shoulders tense, his hand instinctively reaching for the bow slung over his shoulder. He moved with careful precision, drawing an arrow from his quiver as he scanned the cavern's shadows. The sound grew louder, the rumbling resonating with an intensity that sent a chill up his spine. It was the unmistakable growl of a predator that knew no fear. Then he saw it. Two golden eyes, glowing like embers, appeared in the darkness ahead, each blink slow and unhurried as they settled on him. The Nemean Lion stepped into view, muscles rippling under a coat as dark as polished bronze, its massive form dwarfing even the largest of wild lions. Every inch of the beast radiated power, a feral strength that was matched only by an unmistakable intelligence gleaming in those piercing eyes. The lion's face was scarred, testament to battles fought and won, and its teeth glinted in the dim light, sharp and lethal. Hercules raised his bow, the string drawn taut as he fixed his gaze on the lion. His hand was steady, his aim precise. He took a breath, feeling the tension in his muscles, the familiar weight of the bowstring, the smooth shaft of the arrow resting against his cheek. With a final exhale, he released. The arrow flew through the air, slicing toward the lion with deadly speed. But in an instant, the arrow struck the lion's hide and shattered, the splinters of wood and stone scattering to the ground as if they'd hit solid rock. The lion didn't flinch. It held its ground, its eyes narrowing in what seemed almost like disdain, a low rumble growing in its throat, reverberating through the cave. Undeterred, Hercules grabbed another arrow, his jaw clenched in concentration. He released a second, then a third, each one striking true, only to break uselessly against the creature's impenetrable hide. Each failed attempt only seemed to stoke the beast's anger, the rumbling growl building into a roar that shook the very walls of the cave. Dust and loose stones trembled at the sound, and Hercules felt the vibration resonate through his bones. The lion took a step forward, its powerful claws scraping against the stone floor, each movement deliberate, unhurried. Hercules lowered his bow, his eyes narrowed as he studied the creature, the shattered remnants of his arrows scattered at his feet. It was clear now that no mortal weapon could pierce the hide of this beast. Conventional tactics were useless. A realization dawned on him, a spark of understanding that cut through his frustration. This was not a battle he could win with distance and weapons forged by mortal hands. The lion's hide was like armor, crafted by forces beyond human means. If he was to conquer this creature, he would have to abandon his weapons to face it on its own terms. With measured calm, Hercules set his bow aside, letting it rest against the cold stone wall. His gaze remained fixed on the lion as he took a deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the surge of resolve that settled into his bones. This was a fight that would demand more than strength alone. It would demand his raw courage, his skill, his endurance. The lion's lips curled back, revealing fangs that glinted in the dim light, sharp as any blade. Hercules clenched his fists, feeling the hard leather of his gloves bite into his skin. He was ready now, his mind clear, every nerve honed and focused. He knew the risk, knew that the next moments would test every ounce of his strength. And with a final steady breath, Hercules stepped forward, bracing himself for the battle that awaited. Chapter 4. The Struggle. Hercules took a final grounding breath as he stepped forward, closer into the darkness of the lion's lair. The close, cramped space of the cave amplified every sound, from the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots to the low, guttural growl emanating from the beast before him. There was no room for retreat, no space to maneuver away from the danger now pressing toward him, inch by inch. This was a confrontation stripped of distance and strategy. Here, brute strength and raw courage would decide the victor. The Nemean lion stood poised, its massive head low, muscles rippling beneath the impenetrable sheen of its hide. Hercules met its gaze with a fierce determination, his hands curling into fists, feeling the steady strength coursing through his veins. And then, in a blur of movement, the lion sprang forward. The impact hit Hercules like a landslide, the full force of the lion's weight crashing into him, forcing him back several paces. He dug his heels into the ground, his muscles straining as he fought to hold his ground, each sinew tested to its limits. The lion's claws slashed through the air, aiming for his throat, his chest, each swipe precise, deadly. Hercules deflected the strikes as best he could, grappling with the beast's forelimbs, feeling the raw power in each twist and pull of its body. The fight descended into a brutal dance of muscle and will, the two locked in a struggle that neither seemed willing to yield. Hercules' grip slid over the lion's coarse, unyielding fur, his fingers seeking purchase as he wrestled against its overwhelming strength. The lion lunged, its jaws snapping just inches from his face, its breath hot and rancid, a warning of the deadly teeth waiting to tear into him. Hercules dodged, ducking low, his shoulders and back pressed against the cold stone wall, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. For what felt like an eternity, they fought in that close, unforgiving space, their movements merging into a blur of raw power and tenacity. The lion's claws scraped along his arms, leaving jagged marks on his skin, yet Hercules held firm, his own resolve hardening with every close call, every new ache and bruise. The beast snarled, twisting and thrashing with relentless fury, but Hercules answered with equal force, his hands locked around its massive shoulders, refusing to let go. As the struggle wore on, Hercules' breaths grew labored, each inhale pulling in the damp, metallic air of the cave, the taste of dust and blood clinging to his tongue. Sweat and grime coated his skin, the sting of fresh scratches igniting his resolve rather than diminishing it. He could feel his muscles burning, his body reaching the edge of its limits, but he forced himself to press on. He was the son of Zeus, a champion who would not fall before mortal fear or fatigue. Then, with a surge of strength that came from some deep, untapped well within him, Hercules managed to throw himself over the lion, locking his arms around its neck, his biceps straining as he squeezed with every ounce of power he possessed. The lion bucked, its massive frame writhing beneath him, claws scraping the floor in a frenzy as it tried to shake him off. But Hercules held fast, tightening his grip, his jaw clenched with a grim determination. The beast thrashed, its body twisting with a desperate energy, its muscles coiling and flexing as it struggled for release. But Hercules refused to relent, his arms a steel vise around the lion's neck, squeezing, cutting off its breath. He could feel the animal's resistance faltering, its movements slowing, the once mighty roars fading into weakened growls. With a final, powerful twist, Hercules forced the lion to the ground, his grip unbreakable as he held it down, feeling its life ebbing beneath his hands. The lion let out one last, rasping breath, its body shuddering in one last effort to break free. But it was over. Hercules released his grip and slowly rose, his chest heaving as he took a steadying breath. The cave was silent once more, the air thick with the scent of sweat and earth and the lingering remnants of the struggle. Before him lay the still form of the Nemean Lion, the mighty beast defeated, its legend meeting its end in the hands of a man forged by trial and destiny. Hercules stood there for a moment, letting the enormity of the battle settle over him, his body bearing the marks of victory. He had met the impossible, and with nothing but his strength and resolve, he had triumphed. Chapter 5. Removing the Lion's Hide. The lion lay still at Hercules' feet, its once mighty form now a shadow of the creature that had terrorized the forests of Nemea. Hercules took a deep breath, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. The battle had left its mark on him, his arms lined with scratches, his muscles sore from the relentless struggle. But there was still one task left to complete before he could leave this place and declare his victory. He knelt beside the lion, examining its hide, the same armor-like skin that had turned his arrows to splinters. It was a pelt unlike any other, thicker and tougher than any armor crafted by human hands. He knew that to prove his triumph, he would need to bring this hide back to Eurystheus. But the task was easier imagined than achieved. Hercules reached for his dagger, gripping its familiar handle, but paused as he pressed the blade against the lion's fur. The dagger barely made a scratch. Frowning, he tried again, applying more pressure, but the blade skidded off the hide as if it were made of stone. He scowled, feeling the frustration bubbling up, a reminder of the lion's otherworldly resilience. His gaze fell to the lion's massive paws, to the claws glinting under the dim light. Hercules knew well that those claws had been the lion's true weapons, sharper than any sword, deadly even against him. He reached out, grasping one of the claws, and felt its keen edge bite into his hand, drawing a thin line of blood. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. These claws might just serve him yet. Carefully, he maneuvered one of the lion's own claws against the hide and began to work, using its sharp edge to make a cut along the creature's belly. The claw tore through the pelt with a precision and ease that no mortal blade could achieve, and slowly, methodically, Hercules began the arduous task of skinning the beast. The work was labor-intensive, each stroke of the claw requiring both focus and strength. The lion's hide was dense and unforgiving, and Hercules had to maneuver around the powerful muscles and sinew that had made the creature so formidable in life. But he kept at it, his hands steady, his mind clear, the quiet of the cave his only companion. After what felt like hours, Hercules finally lifted the hide from the lion's body. It was a thick, heavy mantle, coarse to the touch but nearly impenetrable, a trophy worthy of the struggle it had taken to win. He stood, holding the pelt up in the dim light, and felt a sense of satisfaction settle over him. This was more than just proof of his victory. It was a testament to his strength and perseverance, a piece of armor that would serve him well in the trials to come. Hercules draped the hide over his shoulders, feeling the weight of it settle against him. The pelt rested like a cloak, the lion's head forming a hood that shadowed his face, its fierce eyes now still, its snarling mouth resting atop his own. The hide felt both familiar and foreign, a mixture of rugged protection and haunting memory of the fight he had just endured. With the cloak now secured around him, Hercules felt the first true hint of pride since beginning this labor. The hide was more than just a symbol of his conquest. It was a shield, a piece of the beast itself that would protect him as he faced the labors to come. For the first time in a long while, he felt a surge of confidence, a reminder of who he was and what he was capable of. With a final look around the cave, Hercules turned and began his journey back, the lion's hide trailing behind him, his new armor against whatever awaited him next. Chapter 6. Return to Eurystheus. The road back to Mycenae was long, but Hercules felt the weight of the lion's hide across his shoulders as both a burden and a badge of honor. Each step seemed to affirm his victory, the mighty cloak draping over him like the proof of his resilience. The sun was setting as he approached the palace walls, its orange glow casting long shadows that made the cloak appear as if it were alive, an echo of the fearsome creature he had slain. As Hercules strode into the palace courtyard, guards and servants paused, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe, and finally to outright shock. Some averted their eyes, while others whispered behind their hands. Word traveled quickly, and by the time he entered the great hall, the room had fallen silent. All eyes were on the lion's hide draped over his shoulders, the massive head perched atop his own, its fangs bared in a final, eternal snarl. Eurystheus was already in his throne, watching Hercules' approach with wide, incredulous eyes. He paled, clutching the arms of his seat, as if the sight of the cloak alone had pinned him in place. It was clear in an instant that Eurystheus had never expected Hercules to return, let alone in triumph. His gaze darted between the lion's head and Hercules' calm, unflinching expression, his mouth opening as if to speak, yet no words came. Hercules stopped before the throne, his stance unyielding, and for a long, charged moment they stared at each other. Hercules felt a flicker of satisfaction watching the king squirm under his gaze, his once confident demeanor unraveling before him. At last, Eurystheus cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. You killed it," he stammered, as if needing to state the fact aloud to believe it. "The Nemean Lion, defeated." Hercules merely inclined his head, the silence that followed amplifying the tension. The victory had been real, and here was the proof, the same hide Eurystheus had been so certain no mortal could penetrate. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Eurystheus quickly averted his gaze, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and resentment. He shifted in his throne, making a visible effort to regain his composure, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "Very well," he said, swallowing hard. "You've succeeded. But from now on," he faltered, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the throne. "From now on, you will present your trophies outside the palace walls. I have important matters to attend to within these walls, matters that do not involve blood and beasts." Hercules suppressed a smile, sensing the full extent of Eurystheus's terror. It was one thing for the king to assign labors from the safety of his throne. It was quite another to face the results of those orders in the flesh. He could see the way the king's eyes flitted nervously over the lion's hide, lingering on the massive head that seemed to leer back at him. For all his authority, Eurystheus was terrified, and Hercules knew that he could use that fear to his advantage. As if to remind himself of his power, Eurystheus straightened in his seat, his tone shifting from shaky to forced authority. "This was merely the first of your labors, Hercules. There are greater trials yet to come. I will see to it that your next task is more fitting for your, reputation." His words carried a thinly veiled menace, but the look in his eyes betrayed his insecurity. Hercules knew that the king's words were not born from confidence, but from a desperate attempt to reassert control. Hercules met Eurystheus' gaze, unflinching, his silence more powerful than any rebuttal. The king's words no longer mattered. What mattered was the journey he'd begun, the path that would lead him through trials beyond what any mortal could endure. Hercules turned without another word, his presence filling the room, even as he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stunned quiet of the great hall. As he left the palace, he caught sight of a small group of guards watching him, their expressions a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. Word of his triumph had already spread, and though he had yet to face the full weight of the 12 labors, he could feel the shift in the air. His victory over the Nemean Lion was more than a mere conquest. It was a reminder that Hercules was no ordinary man. Behind him, Eurystheus remained seated, his face pale, his mind churning with plans to devise the next labor. He would make sure each task was harder, deadlier, more likely to end Hercules' life. But as Hercules disappeared into the gathering night, it was clear that the king's fear would grow with every labor, each one a reminder that even the greatest of mortal challenges might not be enough to stop the son of Zeus. The end of the Nemean Lion. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss new stories. We bring classic plays, fairy tales, and timeless stories to life with a fresh twist. And if you know someone who'd enjoy these reimagined tales, please share the channel with them. Your support helps us continue to grow and bring more stories to you.